raw meat, many of them. That one of their delicacies was raw liver. They would butcher and eat the raw liver. And now this is done in Greenland too.
I know it
said
is.
in Greenland they eat the raw liver. Well, so because of this, you see, they would get tapeworm. Now the treatment for tapeworm was a very caustic medicine administered every so often, followed with a big dose of castor oil. And in order to be sure that they took it, because it was a very nasty medicine, and they didn't have it in capsules in those days, you took it in a teaspoon. So Mother, they would have the patient come to the kitchen at the cottage, and while Mother was doing her work, the Indian woman, it happened to be an Indian woman, would sit there by the table, and Mother would go about her work and have to watch the clock, and every so often she'd give the woman the medicine. And then the woman, the patient would wait and take her final dose of castor oil. Then she would go home. Then the next
Both ways, huh?
the next day, now here was part of it, she had to bring the results, the sample
The stool.
of the results to my mother or dad to look at. If the head of the tapeworm was not there, the whole thing had to be done over again. If the head was there, then the tapeworm was gone. Well, that was just one of the things.
My goodness.
Then this was all a part of their duty. Mother got $87, I believe, a month for doing her job, and Dad's was more than that, and I don't know how much.
Leonard has gave me the figures, but I can't.
87, maybe it was something like that. And so you see, you can understand why the folks said, well, now when we got there, there were no schools, no public schools at all on the reservation. There was this day school which took the children up to the 6th grade, inclusive. And the Indian children, many of them were teenagers, because it took them a long time. With all of these things they had to do, they took them longer than ordinary to get the schoolwork in. Ethel has finished the 6th grade. She is a very avid reader, and she reads a lot and she knows a lot. It's not going to hurt her to just stay out of school. So for 2 years, well, for 1 year I stayed home, and you can see with 2 babies, Mother needed help.
Sure.
Esther, Rose was 6 weeks old when we got there. Esther was, well, there was about 2 years, approximately 2 years older. And that was my principal job, was to take care of the babies. And, well, then the second year, of course, then in the summer, to end up on this duties, there were many, many duties. The wood had to be cut. We heated by wood that was brought in by the Indians, and most of it was cedar, native cedar. And it had to be sawed up by hand, and the boys, the school boys, would do that. Build up big cords of wood out behind the commissary, and that would be brought in to heat the cottage and the day school. Then in the spring we'd begin plowing up to the garden spot with the walking plow, and planting big gardens, huge gardens, so it could be canned in preparation for the next school year.
Sure.
And
Did the Yankton boys help
the
planting?
Indian boys helped, the Indian boys helped with the garden.
I suppose Mother taught how to can, maybe, I don't know.
I don't know, most of the canning was done during the summer.
I imagine they just put the things in a cellar, you know, like the potatoes and things.
A lot of it was. And then of course in the winter there was filling the ice house. I don't think the Indian boys helped with that. But then we had a big ice house, and then the men in the community would go down and cut the ice.
From Buckle Creek.
from Buckle Creek, or, well, not really.
Not, where
From
did you
White
get?
River.
Oh, really? I
Yes,
see.
all it up.
I was wondering about
Or
that.
dam, maybe sitting up dam.
Let me ask you this
Yeah.
about the Indians. Were
All
these
right.
agricultural Indians, or were they nomadic
The
Indians? or-
Sioux are not, the Oglala Sioux are not agricultural Indians, they are hunters.
Hunters,
They're
yes.
hunters. And,
Did they take to these agricultural
they were
processes?
supposed, that was another part of my father's duty, was to
Convert them to
encourage
that,
the Indian men, Indian people to plant gardens, and he was supposed to go out in the summertime and check on them to see
Sure.
if they were planting their gardens and
Oh.
give them, oh yes,
I thought
advice.
that was Pomeroy's because his name was Boss Farmer. and
Well,
I thought that
that's
was
true,
his
but
duty.
Dad was in on that too.
He was?
Oh,
Oh.
yeah, he was in on that too. I can remember him going out with
Yeah.
Pomeroy,
I
maybe.
see.
And,
I know in the letter he
So it
wrote
could be.
that he
He was
bewailed
the
the
big
fact that people were criticizing the Indians for being lazy and not taking care of the gardens. And he said, I know many white men who plant gardens and let the weeds grow. Why criticize the Indians who are not accustomed to this? But then he criticized the fact that when the fair came along, the Indians had a different name for fair, but
Yeah.
when this came along, they had to display their food. And mostly, as I remember, they just had squash and some corn. They didn't have very much to display, but there would be pictures taken to send back to the Indian department to show how the Indians
Yes,
were
it's
learning
all-
to be agricultural. And he said, it's all a
Fake.
big sham.
it was because the Indians, the Sioux, now Navajo, you see, are
Yeah, sure, that's
agricultural, but
different,
not
yeah.
the Sioux.
Yeah,
They were hunters,
Yeah, the Buffalo
fighters.
yeah,
That
Yeah.
whole Plains Indians.
Sure.
Yeah.
They're close.
yeah.
They were not fishermen either. Often
No.
people say, oh, you probably had a lot of fish.
Now, the
No.
old Sioux Empire extended clear into Wisconsin.
I understand that,
The old
yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Originated in the,
Yeah.
at the Wisconsin River
Yeah.
when we took a trip there. So
And they
this
were
is where the
pushed-
Sioux came from.
And they
Oh,
were
yeah.
pushed out.
Yeah, yeah.
And in one of the stories that I read, because I read it last, there was a man named Cut Lip, a Sioux Indian down around Prairie du Chien,
Oh.
whose name was Cut Lip. And I often wondered if maybe they, once in a while they did, as they moved out,
Sure.
that they did name for a grandfather,
They might have.
the Cut Lip. And as I say, Mrs. Serby had it that her husband had interviewed Cut Lip.
You know,
Joshua Lipp, though. There is a
There
family,
is.
and I know now,
Oh.
there. And his name is Joshua Lipp.
They may have.
Then there is Cut Creek, on
Oh, I
which the
see.
family of Cuts live. That's the reason I
I see.
question.
Uh-huh.
Well, it could be they were descendants from a Cut Lip, and one
Yeah.
branch took the name Cut and one
Might have been.
well, see, these things get lost in history.
This is
Well,
right.
Ethel, I'm learning a lot, and I wish you'd go on. Ethel didn't know I was taping this until just now.
Well, here is a thought I had. If you want, if you have something to add, do,
Like
please.
Bill mentioning, because maybe we know these things about the Sioux originating, but people listening to this might not.
they're over there to Wisconsin.
Yes, I know
And
that.
they were pushed back.
Well, let's hear
I might
more
go
now
on a
about the,
little
I want to
bit,
hear
just,
more.
I might tell you a little bit then about, since I mentioned that I didn't go to school,
Yes.
I might finish that up
Yes,
for you, so
uh-huh.
you'll know. That the second year then, the second summer, I was 13. And it was after my birthday. Well, I was 12. I was 11 when we went out on the 1st of July. Then I was 12 in August. And then the next year, well, I arrived there on my birthday in July. The folks decided that it would be good if I would go back down to Nebraska. I was born at Surprise, Nebraska, my grandfather Woods' homestead, and where they had lived at that time. If I would go back there for a visit. Later, I think probably they thought maybe I would like to stay there and go to school, but they didn't say anything to me about that. But anyway, they arranged. Every year at the day schools, the day school carpenter would come around to all the day school for maintenance purposes, to fix up the premises, anything that needed repair, and so on. And he and his wife came in a covered wagon. And I don't remember their names at the moment, but they both came. And he would work there in one-day school until everything was brought up shipshape. Then he would move on to the next day school. Well, they had been there, this carpenter and his wife, and they were going to go down to number 22 day school next. So the folks thought, well, now Ethel could ride down to number 22 day school with the carpenter and his wife. And they knew that the Mr. and Mrs. Swift at number 22 were going to go to Martin, to the fair, which was a town, 25 miles from there. That I could go then, along with Swifts, down to Martin. From Martin, I could take the mail. There was a mail service that went from Martin down to Merriman, a distance of 25 miles through the sandhills.
Was that horse-drawn?
It was horse-drawn wagon by 25 miles of riding down to Merriman. And from there, I could get on the train and go down to Arlington, Nebraska, where we had lived before coming to South Dakota. We had lived on a little fruit farm. I was 5 when we came to South Dakota for the homestead. Then I could go to my Aunt Annie's. We called her Aunt Annie. She was a cousin of my
See the
father's.
Krappenhof?
Krappenhof, and Annie Krappenhof. Stay there a few days. They could put me on the train, and I would go to Surprise where my Aunt Ethel would meet me.
Oh,
And I would stay there and visit my grandpa and Aunt Ethel and Elida for a while. It would be a good experience. Well, I was to do all of this alone, you see. So I did this. They asked me if I'd like to do this. Of course, I thought it would be fun.
Sure.
So here I was, I was still 12, but I was just about 13. So I remember I went with I can't think of their names, the carpenters, to number 22 day school. We stayed overnight with the Swifts. The Swifts were teachers who had come out from Pennsylvania. They were very cultured. She was a trained nurse. He was a very, aristocratic looking professor type person with a white beard. They were a little elderly. And stayed overnight. And Mrs. Swift, knowing what I was going to do, had some almonds. So she cracked those. She said, would you like to crack these almonds and I'll fix them and you can take them with you to eat on the train. So I cracked the almonds. She buttered them, put them in the oven, and roasted them in the oven, and then put them in a sack. And out there, she said, put a little salt on them. This is there now. You'll have some salted almonds to take with you and eat on the train. And so the next morning I got up. She was getting breakfast, and the carpenters were going. We were all going in the covered wagon to Martin. So I remember so well, I learned one lesson on courtesy. I went into the living room, dining room. Mr. Swift was sitting there reading. And I went in there. I was rather shy. I didn't say anything. He looked up and spoke. And he says, don't you know, when you come into the one that comes into the room is the one who should speak first?
My goodness. Yeah.
And I never forgot that.
Sure.
And so I felt very embarrassed, of course, because I didn't know that. Well, I never had an occasion to learn it. So that was his idea, at least. Anyway, then we went to Martin in the covered wagon, and over the wagon trails. It was a distance of about 25 miles. On the way, we had quite a time because Mrs. Swift was afraid the covered wagon was going to tip over. The trail went on some side hills, and she would almost scream and hang on to the upside of the wagon, and she'd say, lean over this way, and we'd all lean toward the upside.
Here we're leading up.
so the covered wagon wouldn't tip over.
Sure.
So we got to Martin. Now, the thing was that I would have to take a room at the hotel and stay overnight because the mail left early in the morning, and I presume that they must have made arrangements with the mailman to take me. He left me, apparently stopped at the hotel. So he left, he was to leave about 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was ready.
At first you got early birds.
I was ready in the morning, 6 o'clock, and left with the mailman. Now, I really shouldn't tell all this.
I want to hear, I've never heard
The
this.
details.
I want to hear the details, make it interesting.
As I said, I was a very shy, timid girl in a way. I was afraid of speaking up, and which I think children are about that age, for fear I might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And here we went, 25-mile trip in the wagon. And I suppose we visited some along the way, I don't know. I sat on the seat beside him, he was riding along. And there was a post office halfway between Martin and Merriman. Well, before we got to the post office, and by the time we got there, I really needed to get off the wagon.
I would imagine.
For a rest stop.
Yes.
And he did say, he didn't come right out and suggest it, but he did say, wouldn't you like to get down and come in? I'll have to get the mail and get the new mail. No, I said, I don't believe so. And I thought, if he goes in, maybe I can get off, and I saw a toilet sitting over there. Maybe I can get off and go over there, and nobody will see me. But the longer I sat there, it seemed like somebody would always be appearing
Yeah,
somewhere.
someplace.
I thought,
My God, I can't.
let anybody see me going to the toilet. So I sat there, mind you, and when he came back, I still hadn't done anything about it. So here we were, another 12 miles by wagon to Merriman, and I tell you, it's a wonder I didn't get sick.
Yeah.
Maybe I had bladder
We
trouble
got
in
there.
4 years.
We got there. Then he took me to the depot, and I got off. I was so glad to get off. Well, I had about an hour's wait until the train left.
I hope you didn't
It was a long
rest
story.
when you got there.
Well,
You don't-
I'll tell you what, I won't explain about that.
I want to hear
But
it.
not on tape, dear.
Not on tape.
Well, I-
All right, so we shut the tape off so we could, that's, cut, go, okay.
Then I got on the train. Also, there were some other teenagers, very sophisticated town girls and boys, several, that got on the train too. And oh, I felt so green and ignorant, you know. But I had my little sack of almonds. I hadn't eaten anything right away all day long. And I still hadn't, but I had my almonds with me. And it seems, yes, it was after mealtime. Anyway, I sat with them, and I can remember thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to visit and have such a good time with, I didn't dare say anything and show off my ignorance, I just sat and listened. Anyway, the next morning, spent the night on the train and I slept. The next morning, pulled into Arlington, Nebraska. And now my father had said, when you get to Arlington, you go to the telephone, and in those days you rang and Central answered and you said, give me Hank Krappenhoff's residence. So I did that. But of course, my father, without my knowing it, had written a letter to Aunt Annie to tell her that I would be coming. So they were prepared, but that I would call them from the depot. Well, never having used a telephone before, no such thing out there, I was a little hesitant. course, somehow I had seen it used or something. I knew what to do. I went and lifted up the receiver, and I guess I had been instructed what to do. So I called Aunt Annie, and I told her that I was there. I said, "This Aunt Annie," and I told her who I was. And she says, "Well, we were just sent down, and one of the girls came down and helped her." So they lived in a great big house, and they were pretty well-to-do people. And I went in there, and I remember, isn't it funny how you remember the little details?
Oh,
They had several girls. They had their youngest girl, Lucille, was 16. Oh, she was an accomplished pianist. But she was out in the backyard. They had a tennis net out there, and she and her boyfriend were playing tennis, and I thought, oh, isn't that great?
Yeah,
How wonderful that is. And we went in and we had supper, and after the meal, Aunt Annie and Uncle Hank went into the living room to read his paper, and Lucille was playing on the piano. Florence, the older girl, who was a teacher, the fourth grade teacher there in Arlington, I don't know why, I thought she was correcting papers. She must have been doing something else at the dining room table. And she was working with papers of some kind. But that was an apple country there, fruit country. Where my father had been working for Marshall Nurseries there. He was a salesman. That's when he got interested in taking out a homestead in South Dakota. Anyway, I went in and sat to listen to Lucille play the piano, sitting in a chair in the living room. Uncle Hank was reading his paper, and Annie came in. She had 3 pie plates with a great big red apple on each one, and a knife, a paring knife beside each one. And she gave one to Uncle Hank. She took one, and she gave me one, and I thought, what am I supposed to do with a knife and an apple and a plate?
Oh, jeez.
So I thought, now I guess I'm supposed to peel this or something. All at once I heard the most welcome sound. Oh, it just thrilled me. I heard Florence, the girl out in the dining room, bite into her apple. And I thought, I can eat it. I
Yeah,
always
sure.
do. So I laid the plate and the knife down, and I ate my apple in my hand like I usually did. But I'll never forget what a wonderful sound that was to hear her bite into that apple. And here she was biting her apple,
You must have
crunching
been
away.
hungry. You must have been
And,
hungry by then, too.
Well, we'd had supper, of course.
Oh, yeah.
And so...
Well,
then-
just a minute now. What
Yeah.
did the others do with the paring knife and the apple?
Did they?
Well, I
think
didn't pay
they-
too much attention. Uncle Hank, I guess.
Every man
he
for
was
himself,
older.
but yeah.
They peeled it or cut it and quartered it or something like that.
always peels out.
Yes.
Yeah.
They probably peeled it.
Look for the
and
worm.
then quartered
There's a
it.
worm in there.
Each one did his own.
Yeah.
We didn't have many apples out in Lips Camp, so it wasn't
I
much
was
of
not an
occasion
apple
for
lover.
them.
Remember I told you?
Yeah. That's
all
all
right.
right. Yeah, sure.
Well, that's wonderful.
Well, I
That's
stayed
too-
there a day or two. Then I took the train, and Aunt Annie, of course, took me down to take the train to go down to Surprise.
Just a minute, Ethel. When did you eat the almonds?
Yeah, all the way out, all the way.
On the train, after I got
picked
the
that up.
train.
No,
Oh,
I see.
yes.
Train.
Yeah, I
Oh,
see.
that's all I had to eat that day
Oh,
after breakfast
I
at the
see.
hotel in the morning.
Oh,
I hadn't
got
been
it.
no opportunity to eat
It's funny that
anywhere else. I
the
just sat in that
driver didn't-
wagon all day.
Yeah.
And,
What are you going down there for, anyway?
but
to visit.
to visit my grandpa.
Ostensibly.
And
Yeah.
I think behind it, the purpose was to get me interested in staying there and going to school that year.
Oh, yes.
Because I did stay. I won't go into all the details. Many interesting things happened.
Oh, I want to hear them.
Yeah.
I love it. I just want to hear the details, that's all. It's
Oh,
not going to
If you don't
cost you,
tell them, how are we gonna know them?
it won't cost you anything.
Aunt Ethel met me at the train, and they were having a surprise. Was a little town on the Blue River. And are you interested in knowing why it was named Surprise, Nebraska?
Sure.
Definitely.
All right. because as you came along the road over the prairie, you came to this drop-off, the high ridge of hills. As you came there, you looked down into the Blue River Valley, and there it was such a surprise to see this little town down there, way down. You went down a steep hill, there on the Blue River. And so they just named it. So everybody was surprised to find a little town there on the Blue River after traveling over the high, kind of a plateau. And so they named the place Surprise, Nebraska. And my grandfather's homestead was about 1.5 miles out of Surprise, Nebraska, and that's the place where I was born. Well, Aunt Ethel met me at the railroad station, and it happened in those days that perhaps you've known of the Chautauquas.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever hear of
Sure,
Chautauquas?
sure.
They were entertainment, a Lyceum company.
Sure.
Would make a contract with certain communities to come and set up their big tent, and then for a week they would have different entertainment groups come in and put on entertainment.
Lecturers and
Mostly
people.
And plays,
Educational.
Yeah,
and
education.
song, musical groups and
Sure.
so on. And the people, many of them in the days of the horse and buggy, would come in and bring their tents and camp. We'd usually set up in where there'd be a park and a place to camp. People would come in and stay there for the week and go to this Lyceum course, they called it, or Chautauqua is what it was called, Chautauqua. So this was going on, so I got to go to the Chautauqua. And with of course, they didn't stay there because they lived just 1.5 miles on my grandfather's farm, Grandfather Woods. And Aunt Ethel, and Aunt Elizabeth lived there too with him. Aunt Ethel was a teacher in the Surprise schools. Well, I stayed out there with Aunt Elizabeth and Grandpa on the farm. Aunt Ethel roomed in town and taught. When school started, there was a country school. And they said, well, you might just as well go to school while you're here. So
What a sneaky way to do it,
so
huh?
I walked to school about 1 mile or so along the country road and went to school. And there was a young man. What was his name? I got a convocation. He was a handsome young fellow, real young. Of course, I never was let on. And
It seems to be a family trait, falling in love with a teacher.
anyway, I went to school there for
Yeah.
about 6 weeks and enjoyed it. I didn't like Chauncey Ludden, though. He was one that we walked to school with.
Oh,
And he was kind of boring.
he had a crush on her.
Well, I guess maybe. Anyway, long about that time, Grandpa says, well, Ethel, how would you just like to spend the winter here with us and go to school?
Oh.
And by that time, I was getting homesick for my little
Yeah.
sisters, and my mother and my father, Mama and Papa. And I thought, oh, that'd be terrible. I wouldn't get to see them for all winter long. And I said, well, I don't believe so, Grandpa. I think I better go home. I think it's time for me to go home. So, okay, there was nothing more said about it. And so it happened that Billy Sunday. You ever hear of Billy Sunday?
Oh,
You ever see a band?
the man that couldn't turn down Chicago. What's that in the song?
Billy Sunday was having evangelistic meetings in Omaha.
Yeah.
My Aunt Elizabeth had gone to nursing school in Omaha and was a graduate registered nurse. And she kind of wanted to get back to Omaha. And she thought, well, it'd be great to go, be able to say, I heard Billy Sunday. So we stopped off at Arlington and picked up Aunt Annie Kroppenhoff. She went with us. And we went to Omaha. Well, it happened, Aunt Elizabeth thought that I should have a new dress. So she dug around among the clothes and she found a dark green wool and she found some wine-colored velvet. So she did make a dress two-piece outfit for me out of this with wine-colored collar and cuffs, and it looked very nice, very pretty. I liked it. And I wore that, was going to wear that on the way home. I didn't have a hat to wear, and everybody wore hats in those days when they traveled.
Maybe they're trying to.
But I didn't have a hat. Anyway, we went to Omaha, we went to hear Billy Sunday preach. I can have him see him just as well as anything,
Could you start
pounding his
going up the
Bible.
line?
And so I didn't, I was so busy taking in the sights, I really didn't hear too much what he had to say, but Aunt Annie and Aunt Elizabeth thought he was great. And then we went shopping in Omaha. And of course, in the fall, there were the counters of sale, bargains. And here was a whole table of summer hats for sale.